Imagine, if you will, an empire so vast, its influence reached, well, pretty much every continent, shaping languages, laws, even how we play sports today.
It's an empire of truly staggering scale. At its peak, what, a quarter of the world's land surface? Touching the lives of millions upon millions?
Exactly. So how did such a colossal entity come to be?
Yeah.
And, what hidden threads connect its complex past to the challenges we face even now?
It's a really striking image, isn't it? This global system connecting continents, cultures for centuries, creating this incredibly complex tapestry of power, trade, and often profound human cost.
Yeah.
The story of the British Empire isn't just history, it's really foundational to understanding our interconnected modern world.
That's exactly the question we're deep diving into today.
Yeah.
The British Empire. Our mission really is to unpack its maybe surprising origins, the driving forces behind its unprecedented expansion, its dramatic decline, and the intricate, often contradictory legacies it left behind. We've been sifting through, well, a stack of articles, historical research, a ton of notes, just trying to really understand how this sort of global colossus came to be and what it means for all of us today.
And we've drawn on a really wide variety of sources, detailed historical accounts, economic analyses, cultural commentaries. We wanted to ensure we get a multifaceted perspective on what is, let's face it, a truly sprawling subject.
You really have to look at it from many angles.
Absolutely. It's essential to grasp its full impact. And we're excited to share some of the most, well, surprising nuggets we found.
Okay, let's dive in then, unpack this. When we talk about the British Empire getting started, what's truly fascinating, I think, is that England was actually a bit of a latecomer.
Right.
Compared to pioneers like Portugal and Spain back in the 15th, 16th centuries. So what was England doing while others were busy, building empires?
That's a great question, because while they did trail behind in that global race, their first modern colonization attempt actually happened much closer to home. In 16th century Ireland, with what were called the Munster plantations.
Ireland, okay.
Yeah, this involved settling English and Welsh Protestant settlers there, and it really set a precedent for later North American ventures, particularly for a group known as the West Countrymen.
West Countrymen.
Yeah, these were powerful merchants and adventurers, mostly from southwestern England, really crucial figures in early seafaring and colonization efforts.
So a kind of internal colonization first, almost like a testing ground before venturing across the Atlantic.
You could see it that way, yeah. And the first British Empire, as some historians call it, really started to take shape in the early 17th century. A pivotal moment was James VI of Scotland also becoming James I of England in 1603.
Right, the Union of the Crowns. How did that change England's imperial ambitions?
It was a crucial shift. Before that, England's overseas ventures often involved, well, raiding rival colonial infrastructures, like the Spanish.
Sort of state-sponsored piracy, almost.
Pretty much, yeah. But with James I, there was a clear strategic pivot towards establishing their own sustained presence. But what's equally fascinating here is how much of this early expansion wasn't immediate state-directed conquest, not in the way we might imagine it today.
How so?
It was driven primarily by joint stock companies.
These are like early corporations, right? Can you tell us a bit more about their role?
Exactly. Think of them as these innovative financial mechanisms. The East India Company, for instance, founded way back in 1600.
Right at the turn of the century.
Yeah. It was initially a commercial enterprise, not an arm of the state, established to administer colonies and trade. This commercial, rather than purely governmental push, is a key aspect of what some historians have called the accidental empire.
Accidental empire, meaning?
Meaning a realm built more by merchants and adventurers seeking profit, not necessarily following some grand state plan, at least not initially.
That's a really surprising insight in how it all began. And speaking of commercial ventures, let's talk North America. Jamestown, founded May 1607. First permanent English settlement.
Correct. But what I found remarkable was just how disastrous those early years were. Sources describe a starving time, 1609 to 1610. Population drops from maybe 500 to just 60 settlers.
It was horrific.
And even rumors of cannibalism. How does a settlement even survive that kind of grim start?
Conditions were incredibly desperate, yes. It was the discovery that tobacco could be profitably cultivated, largely credited to John Rolfe around 1614, that truly transformed Jamestown's economic prospects.
Tobacco.
This lucrative trade basically ensured the colony's viability, but it also created this voracious, just insatiable demand for labor.
And here's where it gets really significant and tragically impactful. That labor demand was initially met through indentured servitude, right? Poor laborers from Britain exchanging years of work for passage.
That was the initial model, yes.
But as demand for tobacco grew, colonial leaders increasingly turned to African labor. The arrival of about 20 enslaved Africans on a Dutch ship in August 1619, that was just a pivotal moment, laying foundations for centuries of exploitation. And resistance, of course. It's such a profound contradiction, isn't it? Because simultaneously, that very same year, 1619, saw the establishment of the House of Burgesses in Virginia.
The first representative assembly in the American colonies.
Exactly. So it set precedents for self-government that would persist throughout North America, creating this stark paradox of democratic institutions for white colonists developing right alongside intensifying racial bondage.
That contradiction really does lay the groundwork for understanding the complexity of the whole empire. Now, beyond Virginia, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, established by Puritans in 1630, also grew rapidly.
Right, but differently.
How so?
Well, unlike Virginia's scattered plantations, Massachusetts developed around these distinct town-centered communities, much more focused on strict religious conformity.
Okay, so different models developing. But if we look at sheer wealth generation,
Yeah.
and frankly, sheer brutality, the Caribbean was where the real immense profits lay.
Oh, absolutely. Barbados, claimed in 1625, and Jamaica, captured from Spain in 1655, they were utterly transformed by the introduction of sugar cultivation in the 1640s.
Immensely profitable, you said.
Hugely profitable, but at a devastating human cost. The brutal working conditions, tropical diseases, terrible nutrition. It led to appalling mortality rates among enslaved laborers,
Which
meant necessitating this continuous importation of enslaved Africans just to maintain the workforce. What really struck me, looking at the numbers, was that Jamaica alone, a relatively small island, produced more wealth than all 13 North American territories combined.
wow, that statistic really brings home the scale of the exploitation.
It's a stark reminder of the engine driving this early empire. And naval rivalry with the Dutch profoundly shaped things too, through the mid-17th century. 3 Anglo-Dutch wars between 1652 and 1674.
Fighting over trade routes and colonies.
Exactly, contesting commercial supremacy. And the Navigation Acts of 1651 and 1660 were specifically designed to secure trade advantages for Britain, bind the colonies more tightly to, metropolitan economic interests.
Keep the wealth flowing back to Britain.
Precisely. A major result of these conflicts was the acquisition of New Netherland in 1664.
Which was then renamed New York.
Right, and this added not just a strategically valuable territory, but also incredibly diverse populations, Dutch, Swedish, German, various African and indigenous peoples into the mix.
Okay. Shifting our gaze now to Asia, the East India Company, as we mentioned, was expanding its operations there too.
It was. Initially, its focus was mainly on acquiring spices, and it relied more on diplomacy than outright military force at this stage. Establishing trading posts Surat in 1613, Madras 1639, Kolkata 1696.
Right. And it's important to remember, isn't it, that at this stage, European military forces in India were still relatively small compared to powerful Indian states like the Mughal Empire.
Absolutely crucial point. The EIC operated primarily as a trading enterprise. It really challenges that common perception that Europeans just arrived and immediately dominated.
So what were they doing instead?
They were competing intensely, especially with the French East India Company, both seeking advantages through alliances with local Indian powers rather than just trying for outright territorial control yet.
Interesting. So it wasn't until later that the company transitioned from just a trading entity to a real governing power.
Indeed. And that transition really leads us into the next phase of the empire.
Okay, so that takes us into the 18th and 19th centuries. An era often called the Pax Britannica, but one that, as you say, came with significant costs. A crucial moment was the Act of Union in 1707, formally merging England and Scotland. What was the impact of that unification?
Well, this newly formed Great Britain gained expanded human and financial resources. It was truly ready to challenge European rivals on a global stage. And this new entity possessed these crucial interconnected advantages: unparalleled naval supremacy,
Royal Navy?
and groundbreaking financial innovation. The Bank of England, established back in 1694, provided stable credit. It funded vast naval expansion and military operations through a really sophisticated national debt system.
Money makes the world go round,
Eh.
or in this case, the empire.
This model gave Britain an unprecedented competitive edge in funding its wars and imperial ventures. It was huge.
So a strong navy backed by smart financial management, that was their secret weapon, effectively. And we see that play out in conflicts like the War of Spanish Succession, right? Lasting over a decade from 1701.
Absolutely. The Royal Navy secured vital victories, including capturing Gibraltar and Minorca, key Mediterranean bases, hugely strategic.
Right. But despite these gains, the loss of the 13 American colonies in 1776, that must have been a significant setback.
Oh, it was a massive blow, a real wake-up call. It prompted a more focused, maybe more resilient imperial strategy. Britain started turning its attention and resources much more eastward, particularly towards India and Asia.
And this eastward shift coincided with another monumental change, the Industrial Revolution.
Right.
Starting late 18th century.
Right.
This transformed Britain into the world's first industrial powerhouse. How did this revolution fuel the empire?
Well, the Industrial Revolution fundamentally redefined Britain's relationship with its colonies. It created this just voracious appetite for raw materials, cotton, tea, minerals from the colonies.
Speed the factories.
Exactly. And new markets for the manufactured goods coming out of those factories. It became this symbiotic relationship, supposedly, but one that often brutally exploited colonial labor and resources, generated enormous wealth for Britain, but at a significant cost to the colonized.
It truly was an imperial engine. And the transportation revolution, railways, steamships dramatically cut travel times and shipping costs.
Yeah, integrating the empire into this vast global economic network, London became the world's financial capital. The pound sterling was effectively the global reserve currency.
And this economic might, underpinned by the Royal Navy's strength, ushered in that era of Pax Britannica, that century of relative global peace enforced by British power.
Relatively speaking, of course. Now let's turn to India. The jewel in the imperial crown, as it became known, but also a place that experienced a devastating drain.
Right. The East India Company's transformation from just trading to actually governing, when did that really kick in?
It truly began after Robert Clive's victory at Plassey in 1757, which secured Bengal, and even more so with the acquisition of Diwani, the right to collect taxes, in 1765.
Okay, so they're collecting taxes now, and this drain of wealth. How did that actually work?
It was a systematic extraction. Britain taxed the Indian population and then used those very revenues to buy Indian products: indigo, grain, cotton, opium.
Wait, so they're using Indian money to buy Indian goods?
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
Obtaining these goods for free, effectively. These goods were then either consumed in Britain or re-exported, financing British industrial development and even helping fund settler colonies like the U.S., Canada, Australia.
That's quite something.
And the human impact.
Horrific, truly
Yeah.
shocking.
Right.
Historians have established that tens of millions of Indians died of starvation during several policy-induced famines in the late 19th century. Their resources were just siphoned off.
Tens of millions. Yes. These were among the largest policy-induced mortality crises in human history. And the colonial administrators, they were fully aware of the consequences. Yet, policy didn't change. It's a stark example of how imperial economic policies could just devastate local populations.
And commercial interest often trumped other considerations, didn't they? Like the first Opium War in 1840.
Right. Britain secured Hong Kong, forced China to open treaty ports to foreign trade, all because China tried to halt the destructive opium trade that Britain was pushing. Profit over ethics, essentially.
Okay. Moving to the abolition of slavery. It's a complex narrative, you said. Not simple moralizing.
No, definitely not. You have the Slave Trade Act of 1807, abolishing the trade itself, and then the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, abolishing slavery throughout most of the empire, though with some exceptions initially.
But here's a crucial detail that's often overlooked. The compensation.
Ah, yes. The British government compensated the slave owners. A massive $20 million.
Which was about 5% of Britain's GDP at the time, equivalent to what, $114 billion today?
Something like that. It's staggering. And it shows it wasn't just a sudden change of values that drove abolition across the board.
So what else was at play?
Well, research increasingly shows that slave revolts played a really significant role, particularly the Argyle War in the 1820s, and especially the large Baptist War in Jamaica in 1831-32.
How did they influence it?
These revolts directly increased the cost and the risk of maintaining slavery. So this economic pressure, maybe more than a purely moral shift for some slave owners, led them to support abolition, provided they received compensation for their property.
Right, economic interests again.
Deeply intertwined, even with such profound social changes. And that contested apprenticeship system and to transition people out of slavery. Initially 4 to 6 years, it was so exploitative it was abolished early in 1838.
Okay. Shifting gears again, expansion in other areas. New Zealand, the Treaty of Waitangi in 1840. That sounds like a prime example of imperial contradictions.
It really is. There were critical translation errors between the English version and the Maori version.
What was the difference?
The English version said the Maori ceded sovereignty, handed over control, but the Maori version suggested they retained Tino Rangatiratanga, often translated as governance or full authority over their treasures, their lands.
Wow. Such a fundamental misunderstanding. That must have laid the groundwork for future tensions.
It absolutely set the stage for conflict over land and authority for generations. And then you have the infamous scramble for Africa in the late 19th century.
Right. Britain acquiring vast territories, Nigeria, Kenya, Uganda.
Pursuing that Cape to Cairo vision, stretching from South Africa, which they acquired from the Dutch in 1806, all the way up to Egypt. This led to conflict, too, like the Boer Wars from 1899-1902, with the Afrikaners, the descendants of those Dutch settlers.
And the Berlin Conference in 1884. That just sounds blatant.
It was. European powers literally carving up Africa on a map, with, as the sources say, no representation of Africa, no regard for the continent's diverse cultures, ethnic groups, existing polities, just drawing lines on a map.
European flags planted everywhere. Meanwhile, Britain was also engaged in the Great Game, right? That rivalry with Russia for influence in Central Asia.
That's right. Afghanistan, Persia, another arena of competition. But by this time, the seeds of resistance were also firmly planted within the empire itself.
How so?
Nationalist movements began to rise in various colonies. You see, the Indian National Congress founded in 1885, and frustrations over Irish home rule continued to mount. These were becoming powerful forces that would eventually challenge the very foundations of the empire in the next century.
And those forces really bring us into the 20th century. What's truly ironic, though, is that despite the immense human cost of World War I, the British Empire actually reached its greatest extent right after the war.
It seems counterintuitive, doesn't it?
It really does, adding 1.8 million square miles, 13 million new subjects through League of Nations mandates, Palestine, Iraq, Tanganyika.
It is ironic, but the seeds of decline were definitely sown by then, and Irish independence was an early, significant step in that process. The Irish War of Independence, a really brutal guerrilla conflict waged by the IRA from 1919 to 1921.
That led to an independent parliament in Dublin.
Yes. And the Anglo-Irish Treaty in 1921 created the Irish Free State as a dominion within the empire. But crucially, Northern Ireland, those 6 counties, remained with the UK.
Partition, which unfortunately continues to have such a profound impact today, shaping politics and identities.
Absolutely. And then a wave of independence began to spread elsewhere. Egypt gained formal independence in 1922, though Britain still held a lot of sway until 1954. Iraq gained independence in 1932.
And Palestine, that was becoming increasingly complex.
Extremely complex. Britain was grappling with the rising conflict between Arabs and Jews following the Balfour Declaration. Eventually, with war looming in Europe, Britain shifted to a more pro-Arab stance, which in turn triggered a Jewish insurgency against British rule. It was a tangled mess.
Then comes World War II. That must have been a major catalyst.
Huge. It significantly weakened Britain economically and militarily. And at the same time, you have the rise of the United States and the Soviet Union as the new superpowers. The old colonial order was truly crumbling.
So the government recognized this.
The Labour government elected in 1945 certainly did. They recognized the inevitability of decolonization and began the deliberate, though often difficult, process of dismantling the empire.
India's independence in 1947 was the major turning point, wasn't it?
Absolutely pivotal, but tragically marred by the partition into India and Pakistan. Massive population transfers, widespread violence, hundreds of thousands died. It's a powerful, sobering reminder of the human cost of these large-scale political shifts.
And the wave just continued, didn't it? Astonishing speed across Asia and Africa.
It really did. Burma, Ceylon, now Sri Lanka independence in 1948. In Africa, Ghana led the way in 1957. And then this remarkable year, 1960, when 17 African territories gained independence.
Wow, 17 in 1 year. Were these transitions always peaceful?
Not always. Violent struggles like the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya from 1952 to 1960 also played a role in accelerating the push for independence, though at great human cost.
And then Suez, 1956. That seems like a real moment of humiliation for Britain.
It truly was. It starkly exposed Britain's diminished power on the world stage. When Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal, Britain, along with France and Israel, launched a military intervention.
But it backfired.
Completely. They were forced to withdraw under intense pressure from both the U.S. and the Soviet Union. It sent a clear message globally. The old imperial order was gone, and it just accelerated decolonization across the remaining empire.
So by the 1980s, the last formal constitutional links with the Dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand were being severed. Acts like the Canada Act of 1982.
That's right, finalizing that transition.
And the formal end of the empire. Is that usually marked by the Hong Kong handover to China in 1997?
That's often seen as the symbolic endpoint, yes.
Yeah.
The last major overseas territory handed back.
But an empire that covered such a vast expanse for so long,
Yeah.
it doesn't just disappear, does it? Its imprint must be enduring.
Oh, absolutely. It continues to shape our modern world in profound ways long after the flags came down.
That's a critical point. Just think about the global impact. The English language, for starters.
Huge. Primary language for, 460 million people? Spoken by maybe 1.5 billion worldwide.
And sports. Football, cricket, tennis, golf, exported everywhere. And some, like badminton and polo, even invented or standardized in former colonies.
It's remarkable how deeply these cultural elements permeated, and you can add Protestantism, spread globally by missionaries. Plus, British educational institutions and curriculums remain popular, creating a significant kind of soft power influence through knowledge professional networks.
And the legal and political systems.
The Westminster system of parliamentary democracy, English common law, they served as templates for many former colony systems. Even today, the British Judicial Committee of the Privy Council still serves as the highest court of appeal for, I think, 12 former colonies.
Wow. But there are significant shadowy sides to this legacy, too, particularly the unintended long-term consequences, like borders.
Yes, the political boundaries drawn by the British often completely ignored existing ethnic or religious groupings, just lines on a map, and that's contributed to ongoing conflicts in many formerly colonized areas.
And migration patterns.
The empire triggered vast movements of people. Millions left the British Isles for settler colonies, the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, but also millions moved between British colonies. South Asians to Malaysia and Fiji, Chinese laborers to Malaysia, Singapore, the Caribbean.
And then post-World War II, significant immigration to the UK from former colonies, fundamentally changing Britain's own demographics.
Exactly. And the Windrush scandal, a very recent example in the UK.
Yeah, that was awful.
It's such a painful illustration of these human consequences. Commonwealth citizens, particularly from the Caribbean, invited to Britain decades ago, suddenly facing deportation threats because they lacked the right documentation from way back then. It really exposed how these historical relationships can still create vulnerabilities today.
And discussions around the empire's legacy, they seem to be constantly evolving. Calls for reparations, for instance.
Yes, sources discuss the growing calls for reparations for colonial crimes, citing precedents like Germany's payments to Holocaust victims or more recently involving Namibia. It's a live debate.
And climate change. Is there a link?
Well, arguments have been made that industrialization, which was significantly fueled by colonial resources, contributed disproportionately to the cumulative carbon emissions from developed nations. So it links colonial history directly to modern climate justice debates.
So what does all this mean for how we evaluate the empire? It sounds like it really defies any straightforward evaluation, not just good or bad.
Precisely. It's never that simple, is it? It's a tapestry of contradictions. Take infrastructure like railways. They definitely facilitated resource extraction for Britain,
Right.
but they also created transportation networks that are still used today in those countries. Educational systems spread literacy, yet often disparaged or actively suppressed indigenous knowledge,
The legal systems establish property rights.
but often dispossessed traditional landholders in the process. Medical advances improved public health in some ways, but sometimes involved deeply unethical experiments on subject populations. These are profoundly contradictory outcomes that we have to grapple with.
And these legacies are continually being re-examined, aren't they? Through literature, film, art, scholarship.
Absolutely, challenging both the old triumphalist narratives and simplistic condemnations, leading to these constantly evolving understandings of this incredibly complex history. The conversation is definitely far from over.
It absolutely is. So as we wrap up this deep dive, it's just so clear. The The British Empire was this historical phenomenon of immense complexity, a play, as you said, with multiple characters, multiple perspectives, which our sources helped us explore.
And its impact on languages, legal systems, political institutions, economies, cultures, it remains profound and often contradictory across our interconnected world today.
Understanding these continuing influences, then, requires neither uncritical celebration nor wholesale condemnation, but rather just careful examination of how these past relationships continue shaping present realities and future possibilities, too.
Well put. It makes you think about how history itself, like any compelling story, is made through that interaction of diverse motivations, collaborations, conflicts. It's true for the empire. It's true for understanding history in general.
A final thought for you, the listener, to mull over, perhaps? We encourage you to explore the specific historical narratives and the ongoing debates we've touched on today.
There's always more to learn about this truly foundational piece of global history.